A fat widow collapses in the snow, clutching her belly and whispering, "I'm carrying another man's child." A lonely mountain man finds her half frozen by the trail and carries her to his cabin. The storm rages outside, but what she says next freezes him harder than the wind. She's running from shame, from the past, and from men who'd steal her land before spring thaw. By the glow of one lantern, two strangers find themselves trapped together. Her with a secret that could ruin her. Him with a soul that's already broken. But when the railroad men ride up the mountain, waving forged papers and lighting fires, he makes a choice no one expected. In a land where law is written in snow and burned in fire, what happens when mercy becomes stronger than blood? Can a man haunted by war and a woman condemned by shame find redemption before the mountain takes them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled like a hungry wolf pack through Snow Creek Pass, whipping crystalline flakes into stinging clouds. Calvin Keel pressed forward through knee-deep drifts, his rifle clutched tight against his chest. The January storm had caught him far from his cabin, but years of mountain living had taught him nature's warning signs. He'd been tracking an elk herd when the sky turned the color of bruised steel. The last rays of daylight were fading fast. Calvin's bad leg, a permanent reminder of Shiloh, ached fiercely in the cold. He'd need shelter soon. As he crested a rise, something flickered in the growing darkness, a weak yellow light, barely visible through the curtain of white. Calvin hesitated. He preferred solitude, had chosen it deliberately after the war. But that light meant someone else was caught in the storm's fury. His conscience wouldn't let him pass by without checking. He altered course, limping through the deepening snow. As he drew closer, the dark shape of a wagon emerged from the whiteout. It listed badly to one side, half buried in a drift. A lantern swayed inside, casting uncertain shadows through the canvas cover. "Hello, the wagon," Calvin called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. No response came. The wagon's back flap fluttered loosely, torn from its ties. Calvin secured his rifle across his back and pulled himself up to peer inside. The lantern's weak light revealed a woman huddled under thin blankets, shivering violently. Beside the wagon, a dead mule lay frozen in its traces. "Ma'am?" Calvin reached out to touch her shoulder. She stirred slightly, her face pale as the snow outside. He recognized her, the widow Parker from Down Valley. He'd seen her once or twice in town, always keeping to herself, though gossip followed her like a shadow. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with cold and confusion. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth, "just let me be. I ain't fit for decent company." Calvin ignored her words. The woman would freeze to death if left here. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her substantial frame. "Can't leave you here, ma'am. Storm's getting worse." She tried to protest again, but her words slurred together. Calvin gathered her up in his arms, grunting with the effort. She was a solid woman, but years of mountain living had made him strong. The widow Parker went limp against his chest as he carried her down from the wagon. The trek back to his cabin was brutal. The wind cut through his wool shirt like knives, and his bad leg threatened to buckle with each step. But Calvin kept moving, counting his paces, focusing on the woman's shallow breathing against his neck. She needed warmth, and soon. His cabin appeared through the snow like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Calvin shouldered through the door, careful not to bump her head on the frame. Inside, the remnants of his morning fire still glowed in the hearth. He laid Sage gently on his narrow bed, then moved quickly to build up the flames. Soon, the fire roared hot enough to drive back the cabin's chill. Calvin hung his frozen clothes near the hearth and pulled on dry replacements from his chest. The widow hadn't stirred since he'd laid her down. Her face remained pale, but some color was returning to her lips. He set his largest pot of snow to melt on the fire, then began brewing willow bark tea. His mother had sworn by it for all manner of ailments, and he'd learned its value during the war. While the water heated, he checked on his patient. Sage Parker was a tall woman, strongly built, with work-worn hands and dark hair streaked with early gray. Even unconscious, her face held a kind of quiet dignity. Calvin had heard the cruel whispers in town about her size, her failed marriage, her situation. He'd paid them no mind. Mountain life had taught him that appearances meant little compared to a person's true nature. The storm raged through the night, rattling the cabin's sturdy logs. Calvin kept the fire well fed and changed the cool cloths on Sage's forehead. Sometimes she muttered in her sleep, words he couldn't make out. He spoke quiet reassurances, though he wasn't sure she heard. Near midnight, she finally opened her eyes. Confusion flickered across her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where?" "My cabin," Calvin said, keeping his voice gentle. "Found you in your wagon. Storm was too bad to leave you there." Sage struggled to sit up, clutching his buffalo coat around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself, Mr. Keel. I'm not worth the effort." Her voice held a deep weariness that had nothing to do with the cold. Calvin handed her a cup of willow bark tea. "Drink this. It'll help with the chill." She accepted the cup, but wouldn't meet his eyes. "I know what folks say about me in town. A woman in my condition. You didn't need to take on such a burden." "Ma'am," Calvin said firmly. "Out. Here in the mountains we help our neighbors. Don't matter what anyone says about them." He stirred the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. "I learned long ago that most folks who talk cruel about others are just trying to hide their own hurts." Sage's hands tightened around the tin cup. "You're kind to say so, but I made my choices. Have to live with them now." She took a sip of tea, then added quietly, "Though I reckon dying in that storm might have been easier." Calvin turned to face her, his expression stern but not unkind. "The Lord doesn't give us burdens we can't bear, Mrs. Parker, though sometimes we need help carrying them." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Sounds like something my pa used to say. Before—" She trailed off, staring into the fire. Calvin didn't press her. He knew about carrying burdens alone. The war had left him with more than just a bad leg. There were nights when the memories still woke him in a cold sweat. Maybe that's why he couldn't leave this woman to freeze in her wagon. He recognized something in her eyes, the look of someone who'd seen too much darkness and was afraid to hope for light. The wind howled outside, making the cabin's timbers creak. Calvin added another log to the fire and settled into his chair. "Try to rest, Mrs. Parker. Storm's not letting up anytime soon." "Sage," she said softly. "My name is Sage." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Mr. Keel, for not leaving me out there. Though I still say you shouldn't have bothered." "Calvin," he replied, "and helping wasn't a bother. It was the right thing to do." Sage pulled his buffalo coat tighter around her shoulders, her eyes growing heavy. "You sound mighty sure about right and wrong, Calvin Keel." "Not always," he admitted. "But sometimes the Lord makes the path clear as day, even to an old mountain man who's not much good with words." She didn't respond, having drifted back to sleep. Calvin watched the firelight play across her face, noting how it softened the worry lines around her eyes. He'd seen that same expression on soldiers' faces, men who'd lost their way and couldn't find their way back. But he'd also seen how the right kind word, the right moment of grace, could begin to heal those wounds. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm. Calvin settled deeper into his chair for the long night ahead, his rifle within easy reach out of habit. But his thoughts weren't on the storm or possible dangers. Instead, he found himself remembering bits of scripture his mother had taught him, verses about shelter from the storm and helping those in need. Perhaps the Lord had guided his steps today for a reason. Calvin wasn't one to question such things. He'd learned that life's paths often led to unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as burdens. For now, his duty was clear: keep the fire burning and watch over this wounded soul who'd been placed in his care. The night deepened, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. But in that small cabin, two lonely hearts had found a moment of refuge from both the physical cold and the chill of isolation. Neither Calvin nor Sage could know where this chance meeting might lead, but for now, the simple act of human kindness had created a spark of warmth that went deeper than any fire's heat. Calvin added another log to the flames and settled back to keep his vigil. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, this was enough. Two souls finding unexpected shelter on a stormy mountain night, each helping the other carry their burdens in their own way. Morning crept into the cabin with pale fingers of light. The blizzard had softened to steady snowfall, blanketing the world in hushed white. Sage stirred on the narrow bed, consciousness returning slowly. Her body ached, but the deadly chill from yesterday had retreated. Calvin was already up, stoking the fire and measuring cornmeal into his largest pot. He moved with quiet efficiency, his limp more pronounced in the morning hours. The familiar scent of coffee filled the small space as he set the pot to boil. Sage pushed herself to sitting, fighting a wave of dizziness. "I should go," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "I've imposed enough already." Calvin didn't turn from his task. Storm's still blowing. Wouldn't be wise to venture out yet. "But surely I can make it to town." She tried to stand, but swayed dangerously. Calvin crossed the room in 3 quick strides, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need rest and hot food. Town's 10 miles through deep snow, and your mule didn't make it through the night." He guided her back to sitting. "Let me fix you some breakfast first, at least." Shame colored her cheeks as she sank back onto the bed. "You're too kind, Mr. Keel. I don't deserve—" "Calvin," he corrected, returning to the hearth. "And kindness isn't about deserving." He stirred the pot of bubbling cornmeal, adding a pinch of salt. "It's about doing what's right." Sage watched him work, noting how his big hands moved with surprising grace as he prepared their meal. The cabin was small but tidy, with everything in its proper place. A few books sat on a rough-hewn shelf, their spines well-worn. A Bible lay open on the table, its pages marked with a piece of deer hide. Calvin served the porridge in tin bowls, adding a dollop of precious honey to each. He handed one to Sage, along with a spoon, then settled into his chair with his own portion. They ate in silence, broken only by the snap of the fire and the soft whisper of falling snow outside. The warm food settled in Sage's stomach, but her thoughts grew more troubled. She set her half-empty bowl aside, twisting her hands in her lap. "Mr. Keel, Calvin, you should know the truth about me, about why I was out in that storm." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I'm not just a widow, I'm—" The words stuck in her throat. Calvin waited patiently, his weathered face showing no judgment. "I'm carrying another man's child." The confession fell into the quiet cabin like a stone into still water. Sage's shoulders hunched, waiting for the condemnation she'd grown used to in town. Calvin was silent for a long moment, studying his empty bowl. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "You're safe here, ma'am. The child, too." Sage's head snapped up, disbelief warring with desperate hope on her face. "But don't you want to know?" "No," Calvin said simply. "Your business is your own. Out here we judge folks by their actions, not their past." He stood, gathering their bowls. "Storm's likely to last another day or two. You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel." Fresh tears spilled down Sage's cheeks, but these were different from the bitter ones she'd grown used to crying. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help someone like me?" Calvin paused in his work, considering his words carefully. "During the war, I saw how quick people were to judge, to cast stones. Learned that mercy's a rare thing, but powerful." He looked at her directly. "Sometimes folks need a chance to start fresh. That's all I'm offering." The day passed slowly, marked by the steady fall of snow outside. Calvin spent hours chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of his axe drifting through the walls. Sage found his worn sewing kit and began mending a tear in his spare coat, grateful for something useful to do with her hands. By evening, the uneasy silence between them had softened into something more comfortable. Calvin showed her how to play checkers with carved wooden pieces, and she taught him a better way to darn socks. They spoke little, but the quiet felt peaceful rather than strained. The next morning brought more snow. Sage woke to find Calvin already out feeding his horses in the barn. She made coffee and stirred up biscuits from his stores, wanting to repay some small part of his kindness. The familiar work steadied her hands and heart. When Calvin returned, stamping snow from his boots, he paused in surprise at the sight of fresh biscuits cooling on the hearth. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," Sage replied simply. She handed him a cup of coffee. "Least I could do." They shared breakfast, and Sage found herself studying her host. Calvin's face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with care but not unkindness. His hands were rough from work, but they handled the delicate china cup with surprising gentleness. She noticed how he favored his left leg, though he never complained about the old injury. The second day passed much like the first. Calvin tended his animals and split more wood, while Sage kept the cabin tidy and worked on mending. Small kindnesses passed between them. A cup of coffee appeared at her elbow when she was sewing. She made sure the water bucket stayed full so he wouldn't have to haul it with his bad leg. That evening, Calvin brought out one of his books, a collection of poetry that surprised her. His voice was rough but earnest as he read aloud by lamplight, the words painting pictures of far-off places and noble deeds. Sage found herself relaxing into the simple pleasure of being read to, something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The storm continued its gentle assault outside, but inside the cabin, something was changing. Like spring ice breaking up on a river, the initial awkwardness between them was giving way to a tentative warmth. Neither spoke of what would happen when the weather cleared. For now, they existed in a pocket of grace, two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Calvin's quiet acceptance began to heal something in Sage that cruel words had broken. She caught him watching her sometimes with a thoughtful expression, but there was never judgment in his gaze, only a kind of understanding that went deeper than words. Each small kindness built upon the last, the way he made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire, how she learned to anticipate when his leg was troubling him, and would have the willow bark tea ready, the comfortable silences that grew between them as they worked at their separate tasks. 2 days stretched into 3 as the snow continued falling. The world outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in white silence. Inside, two lonely hearts began to thaw, warmed by simple acts of kindness and the gradual discovery that even broken things could be mended, given time and gentle hands. They didn't speak of the future or the past. For now, it was enough to exist in this moment of unexpected grace, where judgment had no place and mercy flowed as steady as the snow outside. Each small gesture of kindness was a stitch in the fabric of healing, slowly mending what life had torn. The days stretched like taffy, slow and sweet. Morning light revealed fresh snow blanketing the world outside Calvin's cabin, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious humps and drifts. Inside, life fell into a gentle rhythm as natural as breathing. Calvin rose before dawn each day, moving quietly so as not to wake Sage. She'd hear him stirring the banked coals in the iron stove, adding kindling with careful hands until warmth began seeping back into the cabin's corners. By the time she opened her eyes, coffee would be brewing, its rich aroma filling the small space. On their fourth morning together, Calvin gestured to the massive iron stove that dominated one wall. "Reckon it's time you learned her moods," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "She's particular, but treat her right and she'll keep you warm as summer." Sage approached the stove with reverence, noting its scarred surface and solid presence. Calvin showed her how to bank the coals at night, explaining how they'd sleep beneath the ashes until morning. His hands demonstrated the proper way to layer kindling. First the delicate twigs, then gradually larger pieces. "Like building trust," Sage murmured, not meaning to speak aloud. Calvin's hands stilled for a moment. "Suppose it is, at that." He taught her about drafts and dampers, how to read the stove's hunger in the color of its flames. "Too red means she's starving," he explained. "Blue and white, that's just right." His voice took on a teacher's patience as he shared the knowledge that meant survival in these mountains. When their water ran low, Calvin showed her how to make snow water. "Can't just melt it straight," he warned. "Gotta do it slow, or it'll taste flat as yesterday's promises." They worked together, filling pots with clean snow and setting them near, but not on, the stove. "Let it warm gentle-like," Calvin instructed. "That way it keeps its spirit." Sage nodded, understanding somehow that he meant more than just the taste. Everything here had its own time, its own way of being. Rush things, and you lost something precious. Their days developed a pattern. Calvin would check his trap lines in the morning, returning with rabbits or the occasional grouse. Sage kept the cabin, finding comfort in domestic tasks. She discovered his mother's old recipe box tucked away in a corner and studied the faded cards written in a careful hand. One afternoon, she surprised him with rabbit stew made from one of those recipes. The familiar scent stopped Calvin in his tracks when he came in from the cold. Something flickered across his face. Memory, perhaps, or grief. "My mother used to make it just like this," he said quietly, settling at the table. "I hope you don't mind," Sage replied, suddenly uncertain. "I found her recipe box." Calvin shook his head. "Been too long since these walls smelled of proper cooking." He took a careful bite, closing his eyes. "Tastes like home." They ate in comfortable silence, sharing fresh bread and memories of mother's kitchens. After supper, as Sage washed the dishes, she began humming without thinking. An old hymn her grandmother had loved. The tune filled the cabin's corners with gentle sound. Calvin's hands stilled on the whittling he'd been doing. "Amazing grace," he whispered. Sage paused in her humming. "I'm sorry. Does it bother you?" "No," he said quickly. "My mother. She used to sing that while she worked. Haven't heard it since." He broke off, turning back to his carving. After that, Sage hummed more often. She'd catch Calvin sometimes mouthing the words to familiar hymns as he worked, though he never sang aloud. The music seemed to soften something in him, as though old memories were gradually thawing along with the spring snow. Their 7th night together, Sage woke crying. The dream had been vivid. Her husband's sneering face, the whispers in town, the weight of shame pressing down like a stone on her chest. She tried to muffle her sobs in the quilt, but Calvin's footsteps creaked across the floor. "Sage." His voice was gentle in the darkness. "You all right?" She couldn't answer through her tears. Calvin's shadow hesitated, then moved closer. To her surprise, he lowered himself carefully to kneel beside her bed. "Lord," he began roughly, then cleared his throat. "Lord, I ain't prayed proper in a long while, not since Shiloh. Reckon I forgot how." His voice strengthened. "But this good woman's hurting something fierce. She don't deserve the burden she's carrying. Help ease her sorrow if you've a mind to, and—" He paused. "Help me remember how to be useful in your service." The simple prayer hung in the darkness between them. Sage's sobs gradually quieted, soothed by the unexpected balm of his words. Calvin remained kneeling, his presence steady as a mountain. "Been years since I said more than Amen over supper," he admitted softly. "War took my faith along with my leg. But seeing you here, your strength despite everything, makes me wonder if maybe he ain't finished with me yet." Sage reached out, finding his rough hand in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. He squeezed her fingers gently before rising. "Get some rest. Morning comes early in these mountains." The next day brought weak sunshine that set the snow gleaming like diamonds. Calvin showed Sage how to read weather signs in the clouds and wind direction. She taught him her mother's method for making soap from stored tallow and wood ash. Their conversations grew easier, flowing like spring meltwater around rocks of painful memory. Neither pushed for details about the other's past, but understanding bloomed in the spaces between words. Grace found root in shared meals, in the careful mending of torn clothes, in the quiet acceptance of each other's scars. Each evening, Sage hummed hymns while they worked. Sometimes Calvin would share a memory his mother's singing had sparked. Summer evenings on the porch, Christmas services in the Little Valley Church, lullabies sung over childhood fevers. His voice grew softer when he spoke of her, but the pain seemed less sharp with each telling. The storm that had brought them together gradually loosened its grip on the mountain. Sunlight began burning through the clouds, revealing a landscape transformed by snow. Icicles dripped from the eaves like crystal chimes, marking time's slow passage. Inside the cabin, 2 wounded souls found unexpected healing in simple rhythms. Calvin's limp seemed less pronounced when he crossed the floor to hand Sage her morning coffee. Her shoulders gradually lost their defensive hunch as she moved through her days without fear of judgment. They never spoke directly of what would happen when the passes cleared. Instead, they focused on the quiet grace of present moments, the satisfaction of fresh bread shared by lamplight, the comfort of evening prayers offered in Calvin's halting voice, the peace that bloomed in silence between familiar hymns. Each small kindness built upon the last, like layers of snow creating something new and clean from what lay beneath. The iron stove kept its heart of fire burning, steady and warm, watching over their gentle transformation with metal patience. In the evenings, Calvin would sometimes read aloud from his small collection of books, while Sage mended or knitted. His voice grew more confident with practice, especially when sharing passages from his mother's worn Bible. The familiar words seemed to heal something in both of them, his faith slowly rekindling, her shame gradually easing beneath the weight of ancient promises. Time moved like the snow water they gathered, slow, steady, carrying minerals of grace that enriched what might have been empty. Their days filled with small moments of shared understanding. A cup of tea appearing when needed, a favorite hymn hummed at just the right time, prayers offered without pretense or pride. The bond between them formed as quietly as frost on a window pane, delicate yet strong enough to transform the landscape of their separate solitudes into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered clearing as Calvin stepped out to check his woodpile. The crisp mountain air carried a hint of coming spring, though winter still held the high country in its grip. He paused, his practiced eye catching something out of place. Fresh horse tracks leading toward his cabin, the hoofprints sharp and clear in the crusty snow. Calvin's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, but recognition dawned as he made out the familiar bay horse tied to his hitching post. The sight of that particular mount brought both relief and unease. Sheriff Elias Brand didn't make social calls, especially not this far into the mountains. Inside the cabin, Sage was humming as she worked at the stove, the smell of fresh bread filling the warm air. Calvin cleared his throat. "We've got company coming, ma'am. Sheriff Brand's on his way up the path." Sage's humming stopped abruptly, her hands stilled on the dough she was kneading, leaving white fingerprints in the flour-dusted surface. "Should I?" She glanced toward the back room, her meaning clear. "No need to hide," Calvin said firmly. "Sheriff Brand's a fair man. Served with him at Shiloh." As if summoned by his name, a heavy knock sounded at the door. Calvin opened it to reveal Elias Brand, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. The sheriff's broad shoulders filled the doorframe, and his usually stern expression softened slightly at the sight of his old comrade. "Calvin Keel," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Been too long?" "Sheriff?" Calvin clasped the offered hand. "Come in out of the cold." Brand stepped inside, removing his hat. His eyes took in the domestic scene. Sage at the stove, the smell of baking bread, 2 cups set out for evening coffee. If he was surprised to find a woman in Calvin's cabin, he gave no sign of it. "Ma'am?" He nodded respectfully to Sage. "Sheriff Elias Brand." "Sage Parker," she replied quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Would you care for some coffee, Sheriff? The bread will be ready soon." "Much obliged, ma'am." Brand settled into the offered chair, his expression growing serious. "Truth is, I've come with news that can't wait." Calvin pulled up another chair, his old war wound making him favor his right leg as he sat. "What brings you up the mountain, Elias?" The sheriff accepted a steaming cup from Sage before speaking. "Railroad surveyors were in town yesterday. They're marking land along Snow Creek, planning a new spur line." He paused, looking between Calvin and Sage. "Your cabin, Calvin. It sits near some contested acreage, including a claim that was held by—" He glanced at Sage. "One Thomas Parker." Sage's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the suddenly still cabin. Calvin's face remained impassive, but his hands tightened on his cup. "The railroad's pushing to take over any unclear or abandoned claims," Brand continued. "They've got powerful friends in the territorial office. Been buying up land all through the valley." "My husband's claim," Sage said softly. "It wasn't abandoned. He just didn't tell me about the debts he left behind." The sheriff nodded sympathetically. "That's why I came straight here when I saw your name in the records, ma'am. There might be a way to protect the claim, but you'll need to act before spring." Calvin leaned forward. "What kind of way?" "2 options," Brand said, accepting more coffee. "First, Mrs. Parker could re-register the claim as a lawful widow, proving her right to the land. But that would require proper documentation of both the marriage and Thomas Parker's death. Sage's hands twisted in her apron. I don't have those papers. When I left Missouri..." She trailed off, unable to continue. The sheriff cleared his throat. The other option would be, well, a new marriage. Under your legal name, ma'am, a married woman's property rights are better protected under territorial law. The weight of unspoken implications settled over the cabin like fresh snow. Sage turned back to the stove, her movements quick and nervous as she checked the bread. Calvin stared into his coffee as if seeking answers in its dark surface. "How long?" he finally asked. "Spring session of the land court opens in April," Brand replied. "Any claims need to be settled by then, or the railroad will move in with their lawyers and their hired guns." The bread was done. Sage pulled it from the oven, the homey smell a stark contrast to the tension in the room. She cut 3 thick slices, laying them out with butter and honey, simple hospitality to cushion difficult news. They ate in silence, the food turning to ash in their mouths. Brand finished his portion and stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll do what I can to slow things down at my end, but the railroad doesn't wait for anyone. They're calling it progress." His tone made clear what he thought of that particular notion. Calvin walked him to the door. The 2 men spoke quietly for a moment, their words lost in the evening wind. Then Brand mounted up, his horse's hooves crunching in the snow as he rode away. Back inside, Calvin found Sage standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters like angry fingers demanding entrance. Neither spoke for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts about what the sheriff's news meant for their future. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had become, in such a short time, a sanctuary for them both. Now that peace was threatened by the relentless march of steel rails and the weight of choices yet unmade. Sage's hands moved restlessly, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Calvin watched her, seeing the fear she tried to hide behind busy movements. The simple contentment they'd found in their shared days seemed suddenly fragile as spring ice. The wind continued its assault on the shutters, its mournful voice speaking of change coming to their mountain whether they welcomed it or not. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had begun to heal in each other's presence faced a decision that would shape both their futures. Neither spoke of what the sheriff's words truly meant, that their separate paths had suddenly converged toward a choice neither had expected to face. The fire crackled in the stove, its warmth reaching out to them like a living thing, while outside the wind sang its wild song to the uncaring stars. They sat in that heavy silence as the evening deepened around them, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. The lamp burned lower, but neither moved to trim it. Sometimes silence says what words cannot, and this silence spoke of fear and hope, of trust and uncertainty, of paths crossing in unexpected ways on a snow-covered mountain. Dawn crept over Snow Creek Pass, painting the snow-laden branches with pale gold light. Inside the cabin, Sage moved quietly, gathering her few belongings. Her hands trembled as she folded the borrowed nightgown and placed it at the foot of the bed. The crude leather bag she'd salvaged from her wagon lay open on the quilt, nearly empty, a testament to how little she had left in the world. Through the window, she watched Calvin chopping wood in the yard, his steady rhythm punctuated by the crack of splitting logs. He'd been out there since first light, as if trying to work through something weighing heavy on his mind. Sage understood the feeling. She tucked her mother's worn Bible into the bag, along with the small sewing kit she always carried. The truth was, she didn't want to leave. These past days in the cabin had been a respite she hadn't known she needed. A pocket of grace in a world that had shown her little kindness. But she couldn't burden Calvin with her troubles, especially not now. The sheriff's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. A married woman's property rights are better protected. The thought made her chest tight. She'd tried marriage once, trusted a man who'd promised to cherish her. That trust had led her here, alone, carrying another man's child, with nothing but shame to show for her faith in promises. Sage pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and picked up the bag. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the door. She'd written a note of thanks, propped against the coffee pot where Calvin would find it. It seemed a poor repayment for his kindness, but it was all she had to give. Her hand was on the latch when the door swung open. Calvin stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, axe in hand. His eyes went from her face to the bag, understanding darkening his expression. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Sage clutched her bag tighter. "I've imposed long enough. I thought if I started now I could make town by—" "You won't make it a mile," Calvin cut in, his voice rough with concern. "Storm's coming. Can smell it in the air." She glanced past him at the crystal-clear sky. "But it looks fine. That's how they fool you." He set the axe aside and stepped fully into the cabin. "Wind's wrong. Temperature's dropping. Be whiteout conditions by midday." Sage's shoulders slumped. Even the weather seemed determined to trap her here. "I can't stay, Mr. Keel. You know that. After what the sheriff said—" "Calvin," he corrected quietly. "After all these days, reckon you might use my given name." A sad smile touched her lips. "Calvin, then. But it doesn't change things. The railroad's coming. I have no proof of my marriage, no way to protect the land. I won't drag you into my troubles." He moved to the stove, adding wood with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "There might be a way." Sage waited, watching his back as he worked with the fire. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the silver threads in his dark hair. Finally, he turned to face her. "You could marry me." The bag slipped from Sage's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the floor. "What?" "Not for want," he added quickly, his hands gripping the back of a chair. "Just for shelter, legal protection like the sheriff said. Keep the railroad from taking what's rightfully yours." Sage's legs felt weak. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind spinning. "You can't mean that. You don't know what you're offering." "I do." He sat across from her, his movements careful, like someone approaching a spooked horse. "I know you're carrying another man's child. Know you've been hurt. Not asking for more than you can give, just offering a roof, a name, legal standing." "But why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Calvin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his weathered hands. "Because it's right. Because no one should lose everything to men who only see profit in the land." He paused, then added softly, "Because maybe the Lord put us in each other's path for a reason." The simple mercy in his words broke something inside her. Tears spilled down Sage's cheeks, hot and fast. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd held back for so long. She heard Calvin's chair scrape back, felt his presence beside her. He didn't touch her, just stood there, a solid presence offering silent support while she wept. "I'm sorry," she managed finally, wiping her eyes with her apron. "I don't mean to carry on so." "No need for sorry." He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "Reckon some tears need falling." Sage dabbed at her eyes, the rough cloth smelling faintly of pine soap. It's too much to ask of anyone. You're not asking. I'm offering. He returned to his chair, giving her space to collect herself. Take time to think on it. Pray about it, if you've a mind to. She looked at him then, really looked at this quiet man who'd pulled her from a frozen wagon and opened his home without question. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with cares she didn't yet know. But his eyes were kind, steady as the mountains themselves. Would you pray with me? She asked softly. Before I decide? A shadow of something, pain, memory, crossed his face. Been a while since I did any proper praying. War has a way of making a man doubt. Then we'll pray simple, Sage said, just asking for guidance. Calvin nodded slowly. That I can do. They waited until evening, when the promised storm had settled in around the cabin like a white blanket. The lamp cast a warm circle of light as they knelt beside their chairs. Sage's voice trembled at first, then grew stronger as she spoke. Lord, we come before you seeking wisdom. Show us your path in this matter. Help us see clear what you would have us do. She fell silent, and after a moment, Calvin's deep voice joined in. Lord, if this be your will, make it plain to us both, and if it ain't, show us another way. Amen. Amen, Sage echoed. They remained kneeling for a moment longer, the quiet broken only by the crackling fire and the wind's low moan around the cabin corners. When they rose, something had shifted between them. Not love, perhaps, but understanding. A covenant of compassion that might, in time, grow into something more. Sage folded the handkerchief carefully and held it out to Calvin. Yes, she said simply. He looked at her questioningly. Yes, I'll marry you. Her voice grew stronger. For shelter, for protection. And maybe, as you said, because the Lord had a purpose in bringing me to your door that night. Calvin took the handkerchief, his rough fingers brushing hers. We'll do right by each other then. That's all anyone can promise. Outside, the storm wrapped around the cabin like a living thing, but inside, two souls had found an anchor in uncertain waters. Not love, not yet. But perhaps something just as precious. Mercy offered and accepted in equal measure. They sat in comfortable silence as the lamp burned low, each lost in thoughts of the path ahead. The wind sang its wild song to the uncaring night, but in that small circle of lamplight, hope had taken root in the most unexpected of gardens. 3 days after their quiet agreement, the storm finally loosened its grip on the mountain. Calvin stood in the pre-dawn light, testing the snow's crust with his boot. The surface held firm, promising safe passage for the mule. Inside the cabin, Sage folded her few belongings into a flour sack, her movements precise and controlled. Roads'll be tricky, Calvin said, coming back inside, but the mule's sure-footed. We can make Pine Crossing by tomorrow evening if we start now. Sage nodded, tying off her bundle with string. I'm ready when you are. Her voice was steady, though her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her shawl. Calvin hitched the mule to his small wagon, while Sage locked up the cabin. The morning sun painted the snow-covered valley in shades of rose and gold, but neither of them paused to admire it. There was too much weighing on their minds as they began their descent from Snow Creek Pass. The wagon creaked and swayed as they navigated the narrow mountain road. Calvin sat straight-backed on the driver's bench, reins held loose but ready in his gloved hands. Beside him, Sage gripped the seat's edge, her knuckles white beneath her mittens. Neither spoke much as the mule picked its way around ice-slicked corners and through deep drifts. By midday, they'd covered less than 5 miles. The sun had softened the snow's surface, making progress even slower. Calvin kept one eye on the sky, watching for signs of weather change. The other he kept on Sage, noting how she wrapped her arms around herself against more than just the cold. "Might need to make camp tonight," he said as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "Don't want to risk the mule's legs in the dark." "Whatever you think best," Sage replied softly. It was one of the few times she'd spoken since they'd left the cabin. They found a sheltered spot beneath a stand of pines, just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks. Calvin unhitched the mule and rubbed it down, while Sage gathered dry branches for a fire. Years of frontier life had taught her well. She had the kindling arranged and burning before Calvin finished with the animal. "Got some cornbread left," she offered, pulling out the wrapped package from their provisions. "And there's still coffee." Calvin nodded his thanks, spreading the wagon's tarp between two trees to create a makeshift shelter. The familiar tasks helped ease some of the awkwardness between them, but the silence grew heavy again as they sat beside the fire, sharing the last of the cornbread. "Never thought I'd be heading to town like this," Sage said suddenly, staring into the flames. "Getting married again, I mean, and in such circumstances." Calvin shifted on his log seat, uncertain how to respond. Finally, he said, "Still time to change your mind if you're having second thoughts." She shook her head firmly. "No. You've shown me nothing but kindness, Calvin Keel. I won't back out now." She placed one hand unconsciously over her middle, where her secret was still hidden beneath layers of wool. "It's just, people will talk. They always do." "Let them," Calvin said, his voice gruff with conviction. "Words can't hurt unless we let them." Sage gave him a sad smile. "Sounds like you speak from experience." He didn't answer directly, just added another log to the fire. After a while, he said, "Best get some rest. We'll start early tomorrow." They settled down on opposite sides of the fire, each wrapped in their own blankets. The tarp kept off the worst of the wind, but cold still crept in around the edges. Calvin listened to Sage's breathing even out into sleep while he kept watch, his rifle close at hand. The night was filled with small sounds, cracking ice, settling snow, the mule's occasional snort. Dawn came pale and cold, with thin clouds skating across the sky. They ate a quick breakfast of dried apple and the last cornbread, then broke camp efficiently. The second day's travel proved easier as they descended into the valley, though the road remained treacherous in spots. By mid-afternoon, smoke from Pine Crossing's chimneys appeared in the distance. Sage grew more tense with each mile, her shoulders rigid beneath her thin shawl. As they approached the outskirts of town, a figure in a dark wool coat waved them down. "Mrs. Abernathy," Sage breathed, recognition and relief mingling in her voice. The preacher's wife hurried toward their wagon, her face creased with concern. "Sage Parker! When we heard about your wagon getting caught in the storm, we feared the worst." She turned to Calvin with a measuring look. "And you must be Mr. Keel. Sheriff Brand told us you'd be coming." Calvin touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes took in everything. Sage's worn clothes, the single wagon, their obvious discomfort, but her voice remained warm and practical. "Well, you can't get married looking half-frozen, dear. Come with me while Mr. Keel sees to the mule." Before either could protest, she was helping Sage down from the wagon. "I've got a proper shawl you can wear. Good wool, mind you, not this thin thing. And we'll get you warmed up before the ceremony." Sage threw Calvin a helpless glance as Mrs. Abernathy led her away. He nodded reassuringly, though his own stomach was churning with uncertainty. The prospect of town, of people and their judgments, made him want to turn the wagon around and head back to his solitary cabin. But he'd made a promise. So he guided the mule towards the livery stable, trying to ignore the curious stares from townspeople. News traveled fast in small communities. No doubt everyone knew why he and Sage had come down from Snow Creek Pass. The air grew heavier as he waited by the church, snow starting to fall in lazy spirals. The flurries caught in his freshly brushed coat and settled on his hat brim. Church bells began to toll, their sound echoing off the surrounding mountains. Each peal seemed to mark another step away from his old life of solitude. When Sage appeared at the church door, she wore a dark blue shawl that brought out the warmth in her face. Mrs. Abernathy had arranged her hair simply but neatly, and there was a touch of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there during their journey. She looked like a woman preparing to face whatever came with dignity. Their eyes met across the short distance. In that moment, Calvin saw past her size, past her circumstances, to the quiet strength that had helped her survive loss and betrayal. He offered his arm, and she took it with steady hands. Together they walked into the church as the snow continued to fall, marking the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find on a stormy night in the mountains. The church bells rang out across Pine Crossing, their sound carrying far up into the snow-covered peaks, where a small cabin sat empty, waiting for its occupants to return. But for now, two people who had found unexpected shelter in each other's presence stepped forward to make their unusual arrangement official before God and whatever witnesses the town provided. Mrs. Abernathy stood close behind Sage, her presence both protective and supportive. She'd taken one look at Calvin's face and seen not just a rough mountain man, but someone who understood the true meaning of mercy. Her warm smile as they approached the altar carried approval and something like hope for both of them. The small wooden church stood silent in the falling snow, its weathered boards holding memories of countless weddings past. Inside, the air hung heavy with lamp oil and judgment as Calvin and Sage made their way down the narrow aisle. Every creak of the floorboard seemed to echo in the hushed sanctuary. Mrs. Abernathy had done her best with Sage's appearance, lending her not only the blue wool shawl, but also a clean white handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots. She walked beside Sage like a mother might, her chin lifted in quiet defiance of the whispers that followed them. The pews weren't full. Most folks had their own work to tend to. But those present made their opinions known through sideways glances and covered mouths. Calvin caught fragments of their cruel whispers as he walked past. Desperate times, taking on damaged goods, carrying another man's child, fat widow buying herself a husband. Calvin's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, focused on Reverend Abernathy waiting at the altar. The old preacher's kind face showed no trace of the judgment displayed by his congregation. Instead, his eyes held understanding as he opened his worn Bible. Sage trembled beside Calvin, her fingers twisting the borrowed handkerchief. The shame of the townspeople's words pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. But when she glanced up at Calvin, she saw the same steady strength that had carried her through the blizzard. Sheriff Brand stood to one side, his badge catching the lamplight. He'd removed his hat, revealing steel-gray hair, and his weathered face held the same expression he wore when upholding the law, stern but fair. His presence lent legitimacy to the proceedings, though Calvin suspected his old comrade was there as much for friendship as for legal necessity. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Abernathy began, his voice warm and firm enough to silence the remaining whispers. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God." The familiar words washed over them like gentle rain. Calvin found himself standing straighter, his war-damaged leg aching less as he faced this new duty, with the same resolve he'd once shown in battle. When it came time for the vows, his voice carried clear and strong through the church. "I, Calvin Keel, "Take thee, Sage Parker." The words were simple, but he spoke them with quiet conviction that seemed to challenge anyone who would doubt their truth. His rough hands, more accustomed to rifle and trapline, held Sage's work-worn fingers with surprising gentleness. Sage's voice shook at first as she began her own vows, but grew stronger with each word. "I, Sage Parker, take thee, Calvin Keel." Her chin lifted slightly, echoing the dignity Mrs. Abernathy had shown. The whispers from the pews had faded to silence, as if even the harshest critics could sense the gravity of the moment. Sheriff Brand stepped forward when called, signing the marriage certificate with his official flourish. His signature declared to any who might question it that this union was legal and binding under territorial law. Mrs. Abernathy signed next as the second witness, adding her own stamp of approval to the document. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Abernathy proclaimed, "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. Neither Calvin nor Sage had expected one. Instead, they turned together to face the congregation, united now in name and purpose, if not yet in heart. The townspeople rose, some nodding politely, while others hurried to leave, eager to spread the news of Snow Creek's strangest wedding. As they stepped out of the church, the snow continued to fall in lazy drifts that seemed more blessing than burden. The white flakes caught in Sage's dark hair and settled on Calvin's shoulders, as if nature itself were decorating them for their wedding day. The air held that special hush that comes with snow, muffling the sound of retreating townsfolk and their judgments. Mrs. Abernathy pressed a small package into Sage's hands, bread and cheese for their journey home. Her eyes were bright with tears as she hugged the new bride. "God sees the heart," she whispered. "Remember that." Sheriff Brand shook Calvin's hand firmly. "You're doing right by her," he said quietly. "Not many would." Calvin simply nodded, unable to find words for the mix of emotions churning beneath his steady exterior. He helped Sage up onto the wagon seat, noting how carefully she moved, protecting the secret life within her. The borrowed blue shawl made her look almost regal in the falling snow. The mule seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, setting off at a steady pace without any urging. They left Pine Crossing behind as the short winter day began to fade. Neither spoke much as they traveled. There would be time enough for words later. For now, the creaking of the wagon wheels and the mule's plodding hoofbeats provided all the conversation needed. As darkness fell, stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds. The snow had stopped, leaving the world dressed in white silence. The air held a tender quality, as if the night itself was handling their new situation with gentle care. Their breath frosted in the cold, two sets of clouds mingling in the space between them. The moon rose, casting blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Its light caught the ice crystals and made them sparkle like scattered diamonds. Nature had decorated their wedding path more beautifully than any church could have managed. Sage pulled the blue shawl tighter around her shoulders, and Calvin noticed her shiver. Without a word, he removed his heavy coat and draped it over her lap. She started to protest, but he shook his head. "Need you healthy?" he said simply. "Both of you." Tears welled in her eyes at his quiet acceptance of her condition, but she blinked them away before they could freeze on her cheeks. The coat smelled of pine smoke and honest work, scents that had come to mean safety in her mind. The mule plodded onward through the starlit night, each step taking them further from the judgment of Pine Crossing and closer to the solitude of Snow Creek Pass. The peace between them felt fragile but real, like the first thin ice on a pond, delicate yet holding promise of greater strength to come. Sheriff Brand's words echoed in Calvin's mind as they traveled. "You're doing right by her." He hoped it was true. He'd seen too much wrong in the war, done things that still haunted his dreams. Perhaps this marriage of mercy might help balance those scales in God's eyes. Sage's quiet humming broke into his thoughts. Another hymn, like the ones she sang in the cabin. The tune carried clear in the cold night air, speaking of grace and redemption. Calvin found himself remembering more words from his mother's Bible, verses about kindness and shelter in times of storm. They were married now, bound by law and witness, but more importantly bound by a shared understanding of need and mercy. The stars continued their slow wheel overhead as the mule carried them home, each step marking the end of their old lives and the beginning of something neither had expected to find. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, offering what comfort it could to this most unusual pair. Their breath frosted, their hearts beat steady, and the mule's hooves marked time in the snow as they made their way back to the cabin that would now be home to them both. The moon watched their progress, casting enough light to see by but keeping the shadows soft. It seemed to understand that some things need darkness and silence to grow properly, like seeds in spring soil or trust between two wounded souls. And so they traveled homeward under the winter stars, a man and woman joined by necessity, but carrying the first delicate shoots of something that might, with care and patience, grow into more. The peace between them remained tender but real, as fragile and as precious as the snowflakes that had blessed their wedding day. The journey back to the cabin had left them both weary, but there was work to be done. Sage stood in the doorway of what was now their shared home, her borrowed shawl still dusted with snow, and surveyed the interior with new eyes. As Calvin's wife, the thought still felt strange. She had responsibilities to fulfill. "I'll fix us something proper to eat," she said, moving toward the iron stove with determined steps. "A real meal, not just trail bread." Calvin nodded, stamping snow from his boots before stepping inside. "Got potatoes in the root cellar," he offered, "and some dried beef." The afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's single window as Sage set about preparing their first proper meal as husband and wife. She found comfort in the familiar motions of cooking, peeling potatoes, cutting them into chunks, adding pinches of the precious salt Calvin kept in a tin. The dried beef, when soaked and cut fine, would give the stew body. As she worked, Calvin disappeared outside, returning with an armload of split wood. He built up the fire in the stove until it burned hot and steady. The warmth filled the cabin, driving away the last of the winter chill. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable now, like a well-worn quilt. Through the window, Sage watched him climb onto the roof with tools and patches. A leak had been troubling the corner near the bed, and he meant to fix it before the next snow. The sound of his hammering mixed with the bubble of the stew pot, creating a homey melody she hadn't heard since before her first husband's betrayal. The baby stirred within her then, a flutter so faint she might have imagined it. But no. There it was again, like butterfly wings against her heart. She pressed one hand to her middle, wondering if the child could sense the peace she felt in this moment. "Stew's ready," she called when the potatoes were tender, and the broth had thickened just right. Calvin climbed down from the roof and came inside, his clothes dusted with wood shavings and bits of bark. They sat together at the rough-hewn table, steam rising from their bowls. Calvin bowed his head, and Sage followed suit as he offered a simple grace. "Lord, thank you for this food and this shelter. Amen." The stew was hot and filling, the kind of meal that could push back winter's chill. Calvin took a second helping without being urged, and Sage felt a surge of pride It had been so long since she'd cooked for anyone but herself. "Good stew," he said quietly, and those two words warmed her more than the meal itself. After supper, instead of going back to the roof, Calvin began working with wood at his workbench. Sage watched curiously as she cleaned up, but didn't ask what he was making. The rhythmic sound of his saw and the scratch of his plane filled the cabin as evening settled in. Days passed in this way, each one adding another layer to their shared life. Calvin would leave at dawn to check his trap lines, returning by mid-morning with whatever game he'd caught. Sage kept the cabin, cooked their meals, and slowly began adding her own touches to their home. A cleaned window that let in more light, curtains made from flour sacks, a bunch of dried pine boughs that made the whole place smell fresh. The rocker took shape slowly under Calvin's careful hands. He worked on it in the evenings, testing each joint and smoothing each surface until it was just right. Sage pretended not to notice, but her heart quickened every time she heard him sanding the wood. One evening, about a week after their wedding, Calvin finally carried the finished rocker to the space near the hearth. He set it down without ceremony and gestured for Sage to try it. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her hand along the smooth armrest. The wood gleamed in the lamplight, every curve and joint speaking of care and craft. "Need a comfortable place to sit," he said simply, "for when the baby comes." Tears pricked at her eyes as she settled into the chair. It fit her perfectly, supporting her back just where she needed it most. The rockers made a soft shushing sound against the plank floor as she tested them. That night, as had become their custom, they read from Calvin's mother's Bible before bed. The leather cover was worn smooth with age, the pages soft at the corners from years of turning. Calvin's voice, usually so sparse with words, grew rich and deep as he read the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, "I shall not want." Sage rocked gently, letting the familiar words wash over her. The baby moved again, stronger now, as if listening too. Outside, snow began to fall once more, but inside the cabin was warm and bright with lamplight. When Calvin finished reading, Sage found herself speaking from her heart. "I feel light again," she said softly. "Like a burden's been lifted. I reckon God hasn't forgotten me after all." Calvin looked up from the Bible, his eyes meeting hers across the lamplit space. "No," he said firmly, "he hasn't." The evening stretched out peaceful and warm around them. Calvin added wood to the fire, while Sage continued rocking, her hands resting on her growing belly. The baby's movements had become more noticeable over the past week, like secret messages meant just for her. Sometimes in the evenings, when the day's work was done, they would share stories, careful ones at first, then gradually more personal. Sage told him about growing up on her father's farm in Missouri, about learning to make soap from her mother, about the simple joys of family life before the war changed everything. Calvin spoke little of the war itself, but he told her about his mother, who had taught him his letters using that very Bible. He described the gardens she had kept, the way she could coax flowers to grow even in the poorest soil. Sometimes when he spoke of her, his voice grew soft with memory. Their laughter, when it came, started quiet, a shared smile at a burned biscuit, a chuckle over a rabbit that had somehow escaped all of Calvin's traps. But it grew naturally, like wild roses finding sun after winter, until the cabin rang with it. One evening, as Sage sat in her rocker mending one of Calvin's shirts, she began humming again. Not a hymn this time, but a gentle lullaby her mother had sung. Without thinking, she laid one hand on her belly, feeling the baby stir in response to the melody. Calvin glanced up from where he was cleaning his rifle, his eyes soft in the lamplight. She might have imagined it, but she thought she saw him tap one foot in time with her humming. The days settled into a rhythm as comfortable as the rocker's gentle motion. Each morning brought its own tasks: water to haul, bread to bake, traps to check. But now these chores felt less like burdens and more like the building blocks of a life they were creating together. Sage found herself watching Calvin when he didn't notice, the careful way he split wood so she would have pieces that fit easily in the stove. How he always made sure her water bucket was full before leaving for his trap lines. The gentle way he helped her up when her growing belly made it harder to rise from the rocker. The cabin itself seemed to grow warmer, more welcoming. The fixed roof kept out every drop of rain and melting snow. The curtains Sage had made cast morning light in patterns across the floor. Even the iron stove seemed to burn brighter, as if it too approved of their arrangement. Their evening Bible readings became precious times of peace. Sometimes Calvin would pause in his reading to explain a passage, showing more learning than his quiet ways usually revealed. Sage found herself looking forward to these moments, when his voice would fill the cabin with ancient words of hope and promise. "For I know the plans I have for you," he read one night. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Sage rocked slowly, letting the words sink deep into her heart. The baby moved within her, strong and sure now, and she smiled. Perhaps God's plans were stranger and more wonderful than she had imagined. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. The same stars that had witnessed their wedding night now watched over their growing contentment. The peace she felt wasn't just the absence of trouble. It was something deeper, more solid, like the foundation stones of their cabin. Calvin closed the Bible carefully, his rough hands gentle with the old leather. Their eyes met across the lamp-lit room, and something unspoken passed between them. Something as natural as breathing, as certain as sunrise. The fire crackled in the stove, sending out waves of warmth. Outside, an owl called softly to its mate. Inside, the rocker made its gentle shushing sound against the floor as Sage rocked, her hands folded over her growing child, her heart full of a joy she had thought forever lost. The morning dawned gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the mountains like a wool blanket. Sage stood at the cabin window, one hand pressed against the cold glass, watching as a smart buggy made its way up the snowy path toward their home. The horse pulling it was too fine for these parts, a sleek bay that looked more suited to Denver streets than mountain trails. "Calvin," she called softly. "Someone's coming." Calvin rose from where he'd been mending a trap by the fire, his movements careful as he favored his bad leg. The winter damp always made the old war wound ache worse. He joined her at the window, his shoulder brushing hers as they watched the buggy approach. The man who stepped down from the vehicle wore a city coat and polished boots that seemed to mock the muddy snow around them. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the confident air of someone used to having his way. Even before he introduced himself, Sage felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. Calvin opened the door, positioning himself so his broad shoulders filled the frame. "Can I help you? Mr. Keel, I presume?" The stranger's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Theodore Vickers, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company." He held out a gloved hand that Calvin didn't take. Sage moved closer to her husband, unconsciously laying one hand over her growing belly. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her unease. "May I come in?" Vickers asked, though he was already stepping forward, forcing Calvin to either move aside or appear rude. "Quite a remote location you've chosen here. Rather inconvenient for progress, wouldn't you say?" The cabin suddenly felt smaller with Vickers in it. He glanced around with barely concealed disdain, his gaze lingering on Sage's rough-hewn furniture and Calvin's hunting gear. "What brings you up the mountain, Mr. Vickers?" Calvin's voice was level, but Sage could see the tension in his jaw. "Business, I'm afraid." Vickers set his portfolio on their table without asking permission. "There seem to be some irregularities with your land claim and your recent marriage." Sage's heart skipped a beat. She moved closer to Calvin, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Our papers are in order," Calvin said. "Sheriff Brand witnessed everything proper." "Ah yes, your friendly local lawman." Vickers smiled thinly as he withdrew several documents from his portfolio. "Unfortunately, Sheriff Brand's authority doesn't supersede railroad interests. You see, this entire valley has been designated for the new rail line, and your arrangement doesn't meet legal requirements for homestead rights." "What do you mean?" Sage's voice came out smaller than she intended. Vickers turned his cold gaze on her. "Well, my dear lady, your previous marriage license was never properly dissolved. Your late husband's death certificate was never filed with territorial authorities, which makes your current marriage legally questionable at best." Calvin's hand found Sage's, squeezing gently. "That's nonsense. Her husband's been gone more than a year." "Without proper documentation, I'm afraid sentiment counts for very little." Vickers produced another paper with a flourish. "And then there's the matter of your own status, Mr. Keel. Your military discharge papers indicate you were wounded at Shiloh. According to territorial law, a man with a permanent disability cannot claim homestead rights without proving his ability to work the land." The cabin grew so quiet, Sage could hear the wind whistling through the cabin's eaves. Calvin's face had gone pale beneath his beard. "I've worked this land for 5 years, Calvin said, his voice rough. "Built every wall of this cabin with my own hands. And yet the law is quite clear." Vickers spread his papers across their table like a card dealer. "You have no legal right to this property. The railroad's claim supersedes any squatter's rights you might have assumed." "We're not squatters," Sage protested. "We're God-fearing people trying to make a home." Vickers' laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Paper beats prayer, mountain man. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, we'll be forced to take less pleasant measures." Calvin took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. Vickers didn't flinch, but his hand moved to his coat pocket in a way that made Sage's blood run cold. "I wouldn't advise violence, Mr. Keel," Vickers said softly. "That would only make things worse for your wife." He spat the last word like it tasted bitter. "Get out." Calvin's voice was deadly quiet. "Gladly." Vickers gathered his papers with deliberate slowness. 30 days, Mr. Keel. I suggest you use them wisely." He paused at the door, adjusting his gloves. "Oh, and congratulations on the impending arrival. I do hope you find suitable accommodation before the blessed event." The door closed behind him with a final sounding click. Through the window, Sage watched him climb back into his fancy buggy and flick the reins. The horse's hooves kicked up snow as it turned down the mountain path. When he was gone, the silence in the cabin grew thick and heavy. Calvin stood rigid by the door, his breathing harsh. Sage could see the muscle working in his jaw, the way his hands still clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Calvin?" She touched his arm gently. He jerked away as if her touch burned. "I need air!" The door banged behind him as he strode out into the gray morning. Sage sank into a rocking chair, one hand pressed against her mouth to hold back a sob. The baby kicked sharply, and she rubbed her belly in slow circles, trying to calm both the child and herself. Through the window, she could see Calvin pacing in the yard, his limp more pronounced than usual. Steam rose from his shoulders in the cold air as he moved back and forth like a caged animal. Finally, he stopped at the woodpile and began to swing the axe with furious energy, sending chips flying. Inside the cabin, Sage's eyes fell on the Bible sitting on the shelf. She wanted to reach for it, to find comfort in its familiar words, but Vickers' mocking voice echoed in her head. Paper beats prayer. The morning light seemed dimmer now, the cabin's warmth less certain. She rocked slowly in the chair Calvin had made her, listening to the rhythmic thud of the axe outside. Each blow seemed to echo the questions pounding in her heart. What would they do? Where would they go? How could papers and rules deny what God had blessed? The baby moved again, reminding her that time was not on their side. Spring would come soon enough, bringing with it both new life and, perhaps, the death of everything they'd built here. From outside came the sound of splitting wood and Calvin's labored breathing. Sage closed her eyes and began to pray, not with paper or words, but with the desperate faith of a woman who had already lost one home and couldn't bear to lose another. The gray morning wore on, heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of Vickers' threats. Even the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen to the couple who had dared to build their lives upon its slopes. Calvin kept swinging the axe long after they had enough wood for a week. Each stroke seemed to echo Vickers' words, each split log a reminder of how easily their world could be broken apart. The sound filled the cold air like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, and somehow terribly sad. Inside the cabin, Sage sat in her rocker, running her fingers over the smooth wood of its arms, touching each careful joint and polished surface. Every detail spoke of Calvin's dedication, his quiet way of showing care. How could any paper from any railroad deny the truth of such things? The morning stretched on, gray and endless, while tension filled their little cabin like smoke. Outside, the mountain stood silent witness to their troubles, their snow-covered peaks indifferent to the threats of men with papers and plans to reshape the land below. The winter dusk settled early over Snow Creek Pass, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that even the cabin's sturdy walls couldn't fully keep at bay. Sage stood at the window, watching shadows lengthen across the snow while Calvin tended the fire. Neither had spoken much since Vickers' morning visit, their thoughts too heavy for words. The clatter of hooves broke the evening silence. Through the frost-rimmed glass, Sage spotted 3 riders approaching through the gathering gloom. Her heart sank as she recognized Vickers' smart buggy, flanked by 2 mounted men wearing deputy badges. "Calvin," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They're back." Calvin rose from the hearth, his bad leg stiff from sitting. He moved to stand beside her, one weathered hand coming to rest protectively on her shoulder. They watched together as the men dismounted in their yard, their boots crunching in the crusty snow. This time Vickers didn't bother knocking. He threw the door open, letting in a blast of cold air that made the lantern flames dance. The deputies followed him in, hands resting meaningfully on their holstered pistols. "Evening, folks," Vickers said, his cultured voice dripping with false courtesy. "I'm afraid I need to see your documentation again." "You've seen everything this morning," Calvin growled. "Get out of our home." "Ah, but that's just it." Vickers smiled thinly. "This isn't your home anymore. And those papers you showed me, they need to be properly filed with the railroad office." Sage clutched the tin box containing their precious documents closer to her chest. "These are our only copies." "Then you'd best hand them over, ma'am." One of the deputies took a step forward, his spurs jingling against the plank floor. Calvin moved to stand between them and Sage. "You have no right." The second deputy's gun cleared its holster with practiced speed. "Don't make this difficult, Keel." The cabin grew very still. Sage could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She looked at Calvin, saw the muscle working in his jaw, the way his hands had balled into fists at his sides. His war wound had left him with a permanent limp, but she knew he was still dangerous when cornered. "Calvin," she said softly, touching his arm. "Don't." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with helpless rage. For a moment she thought he might fight anyway. Then his shoulders slumped, just slightly. Vickers stepped forward, hand extended. "The papers, Mrs. Keel. Or should I say, Mrs. Parker, since your current marriage isn't exactly legitimate." With trembling fingers, Sage opened the tin box. Inside lay their marriage license, her claim papers, and the few other documents that proved their right to this land and life together. Each one represented a thread of hope, now about to be severed. "Smart choice," Vickers said as she handed them over. He rifled through the papers with obvious satisfaction, then pulled out their marriage license. "Now let's make things absolutely clear about your situation." He stepped to the door and out into the snow-covered yard. The deputies motioned for Calvin and Sage to follow. The night air bit at their faces as they watched Vickers hold their marriage license up in the moonlight. "This," he said, "is worth less than the paper it's printed on." He produced a match from his coat pocket and struck it against his boot. "No!" Sage cried out, starting forward. The deputies moved quickly. One grabbed Sage's arms, pulling her back. The other caught Calvin as he lunged for Vickers, driving a fist into his stomach. Calvin doubled over but tried to fight back. The deputy's club came down hard across his shoulders, sending him to his knees in the snow. "Stop it!" Sage screamed, struggling against the deputy's grip. "Please!" Vickers held the burning match to their marriage license. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening at the edges. He let it fall to the snow, where it continued to burn, the flames casting dancing shadows across the white ground. Calvin fought to rise, earning another blow that split his lip. Blood dripped onto the snow as he watched their marriage license burn, his face a mask of helpless fury. "Consider that an object lesson," Vickers said, pocketing the rest of their papers. "The railroad doesn't recognize your claim to this land or your unconventional arrangement. You have 25 days left to vacate. I suggest you use them wisely." He nodded to his deputies, who released their holds on Calvin and Sage. Calvin stayed on his knees in the snow, blood running down his chin, while Sage rushed to his side. "Good evening, folks," Vickers said, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. He and his men mounted up, their horses' hooves cutting dark tracks in the snow as they rode away into the night. For a long moment, neither Calvin nor Sage moved. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the soft hiss of snow falling on the remains of their burning marriage license. Finally, Sage helped Calvin to his feet, supporting him as they made their way back into the cabin. Inside, she sat him by the fire and fetched clean rags and water. Her hands shook as she gently cleaned the blood from his face, but her touch was steady. Calvin winced as she dabbed at his split lip. "Your hands," she whispered, noticing his scraped and bloody knuckles from where he'd tried to fight back. She wrapped his hands carefully with strips torn from one of her clean aprons. Calvin sat silent through it all, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in its flames. The familiar warmth of their cabin felt hollow now, as if Vickers and his men had taken more than just papers when they left. Sage finished bandaging Calvin's hands and sat beside him. Words seemed inadequate in the face of what they'd just lost. Instead, she reached out and took his bandaged hand in hers. His fingers tightened around hers, speaking volumes in that simple pressure. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows on the walls as the night deepened outside. Neither of them moved to banquet or seek their beds. They sat together, watching the flames dance, each lost in their own thoughts but anchored by their clasped hands. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Still they sat, keeping their wordless vigil as the night slowly gave way to dawn. The first gray light of morning crept through the windows, finding them exactly as they'd been all night, together, silent, holding on to each other as if their touch was the only real thing left in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and cruel. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the tracks left by Vickers and his men, burying the ashes of their marriage license. But it couldn't bury the memory of what had happened, or the fear of what was still to come. Calvin's hand tightened on Sage's as the dawn grew stronger. She looked at his profile, stern and troubled in the growing light. His split lip had swollen, and bruises were darkening on his jaw. Yet there was something undefeated in the set of his shoulders, a stubborn resistance that even Vickers' cruelty hadn't broken. The baby stirred within her, as if sensing her distress. Sage placed her free hand on her swelling belly, feeling the movement beneath. Whatever happened, she knew they couldn't give up. Too much depended on their strength now, their home, their future, the little life growing inside her. The sun rose fully, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Another day was beginning, bringing them one day closer to Vickers' deadline. But for now they remained by the dying fire, hands clasped, watching the dawn break over their threatened home. In the growing light, Sage could see the determination hardening in Calvin's eyes, matching the resolve she felt in her own heart. They might have lost their papers, but they still had each other. And sometimes, she thought, that had to be enough to begin again. The morning light filled their cabin, touching every surface Calvin had crafted with his own hands. The smooth-planed table, the sturdy chairs, the rocker he'd made for her. Each piece was a testament to what could be built with patience and care, regardless of what any paper might say. They sat together as the new day brightened, their silence no longer empty but filled with shared purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together, their bond stronger than any document Vickers could burn. The days after Vickers' visit dragged like honey frozen in winter. Snow began its slow retreat from the mountain, leaving behind mud and memories of that terrible night. Inside the cabin, a different kind of chill had settled, one no fire could chase away. Calvin moved through their shared space like a shadow, barely making eye contact with Sage. His shoulders carried the weight of defeat, and his hands, still scabbed from the fight, worked mechanically at tasks that once brought him peace. The gentle domesticity they'd built now felt fragile as spring ice. At breakfast, Calvin would stare into his coffee cup, as if searching its depths for answers. Sage would serve him cornbread or porridge, and he'd manage a grunt of thanks before heading out to tend the animals. The bruises on his face had faded to yellowish marks, but the wound to his pride cut deeper with each passing day. Sage kept to her own routine, though her growing belly made some tasks more challenging. She'd pause while sweeping to catch her breath, one hand pressed against the small of her back. The baby grew stronger, making its presence known with kicks and turns that sometimes stopped her mid-chore. During these moments, she'd find herself humming softly, old hymns her mother had sung, lullabies that brought comfort in their familiar verses. But whenever her voice carried through the cabin, Calvin would stiffen and find reason to step outside. He couldn't bear to watch her quiet strength, her ability to find hope even now. Each note reminded him of his failure to protect what mattered most. The snow continued its slow surrender to spring. Rivulets of meltwater carved channels through the mud, their constant trickle a reminder of time slipping away. 25 days had seemed like forever that night, but now each sunset brought them closer to Vickers's deadline. One morning, Sage found Calvin's side of the bed empty before dawn. Through the window, she watched him split wood with fierce, angry strokes. The axe rose and fell like a thing possessed, sending chips flying in all directions. He worked until his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the morning chill, as if trying to beat his frustration into the logs. Later that day, she caught him standing at the corner of their property, staring down the road toward town with such intensity it made her shiver. His hand kept straying to the rifle slung across his back, fingers twitching against the wooden stock. The garden needed tending, mud or no mud. Sage knelt carefully in the soft earth, her belly making balance tricky. As she pulled early weeds from around the sprouting peas, she sang an old spiritual her grandmother had taught her. The words spoke of valleys and shadows, of fear and faith walking hand in hand. Through the valley of the shadow I must go. From the corner of her eye, she saw Calvin flinch at the verse. He turned away, shoulders tight with shame, and disappeared into the barn. The song died in her throat, replaced by worry. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men fresh from war, haunted by memories and hunting for revenge. The days grew longer, but the silence between them stretched wider. Calvin took to spending hours in the barn, emerging only for meals he barely touched. Sage would watch him push food around his plate, wanting to reach across the table and take his hand, but something in his posture warned her away. One evening, as sunset painted the muddy yard in shades of amber and rose, Sage heard unusual movement from their bedroom. The familiar sound of a rifle being cleaned reached her ears. Her heart clutched tight in her chest. She found Calvin sitting on their bed, his rifle across his knees. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning and checking each part. A box of ammunition sat beside him, and his saddlebag lay packed near the door. "Calvin?" Her voice quavered slightly. He didn't look up, continuing his methodical work on the rifle. "Got business in town?" "What kind of business needs a cleaned rifle at sunset?" She stepped closer, one hand resting protectively over her belly, his hands stilled on the weapon. "The kind that needs settling." "You mean to confront Vickers?" It wasn't a question. Calvin's jaw tightened. Man needs to learn there's consequences to burning other folks' lives. "And what consequences will there be for you?" Sage moved to stand before him. "For your soul?" "My soul?" His laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Ain't much left of that to worry about." "That's not true." Sage knelt carefully beside the bed, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I've seen your soul, Calvin Keel, in every gentle thing you've done since finding me in that storm, in every prayer you've spoken, every kindness you've shown." His fingers tightened on the rifle. "Fat lot of good prayers and kindness did us. Paper beats prayer," he said. "Maybe he's right. Maybe it's time for lead to beat paper." "No." Sage reached out, laying her hand over his where it gripped the rifle. "Violence won't save our home. It'll just destroy what's left of the man I—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "The man I've come to care for." Calvin's breath caught. His eyes, when they met hers, were full of pain and something else, a desperate need to believe. "I failed you," he whispered. "Failed to protect what's ours. You protected what matters most." Sage took his calloused hand and pressed it against her rounded belly. As if on cue, the baby kicked against his palm. "This life, this family we're making, that's worth more than any paper Vickers can burn," Calvin's fingers trembled against her belly as another kick pressed against his hand. The rigid line of his shoulders softened slightly. "I don't know how to fight this kind of battle," he admitted. "Give me a rifle and a clear shot that I understand. But this—" He gestured helplessly at their situation. "Then we'll learn together." Sage kept his hand pressed to her belly, letting him feel the strong movement of the child within. "But not with violence, not with vengeance. That path leads back to darkness, and I won't watch you lose yourself to it." The baby kicked again, more forcefully this time. Despite himself, Calvin's lips twitched in something close to a smile. "Strong little thing. Like its papa." The words slipped out before Sage could catch them. She felt Calvin's startled intake of breath, but didn't look away. "The man who carried me through a blizzard, who offered marriage to a stranger to protect her. That's the strength we need now." Slowly, as if the movement caused him physical pain, Calvin set the rifle aside. His hand stayed pressed against Sage's belly, feeling the life that moved beneath her skin. The sunset light through their window caught the tears that tracked silently down his weathered cheeks. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "We don't have to know yet." Sage reached up to brush the tears from his face. "We just have to choose each day to face it together, without violence, without letting bitterness poison what we've built." Calvin closed his eyes, leaning slightly into her touch. The tension began to drain from his frame, like snow melting in spring sunshine. When he opened his eyes again, the dangerous glint had faded, replaced by exhaustion and something that looked like hope. "Might be you're right," he said softly. "Seems you usually are." Sage smiled, relief making her feel lightheaded. "Not usually. Just when it matters most." Calvin's other hand came up to cover hers, where it still rested against his cheek. They stayed that way as the sunset painted their bedroom in deepening shades of gold, the rifle forgotten beside them, the baby moving beneath their joined hands. Outside, spring wind rustled through bare branches, promising new growth. The sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves marked time's passage, but no longer with the same desperate urgency. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, choosing love over vengeance, hope over fear. The darkness that had gripped Calvin's spirit began to loosen its hold, pushed back by the simple power of Sage's faith in him. He helped her to her feet, then carefully packed away the rifle and ammunition. Each movement was deliberate, like a man setting down a heavy burden he'd carried too long. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sage began to sing again. This time, Calvin didn't flinch or leave. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened, letting the gentle words wash over him like healing rain. His hand found hers in the firelight, and he held on as if she were his anchor in a storm-tossed sea. The baby moved between them, strong and sure, reminding them both that life continued to grow even in uncertain times. Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light steady and unchanging, much like the love that had begun to bloom in their hearts, stronger than any paper, more enduring than any law. Sage's arms ached as she hauled the heavy trunk from beneath their bed. The worn leather case had belonged to her first husband, full of papers she'd never had the heart to sort through. But now, with spring cleaning upon them and Calvin out checking his trap lines, she knew it was time. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight as she opened the lid. The musty smell of old leather and paper wafted up. Her fingers trembled as she lifted out bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. At the bottom, beneath a stack of deed papers, she found an official-looking envelope sealed with wax. Her breath caught as she carefully broke the seal. Inside were several documents, their edges crisp despite their age. Federal letterhead crowned each page, complete with golden seals and careful signatures. As she read, her eyes widened. The letters detailed agreements between her late husband and the local Ute band. In exchange for peaceful passage through their hunting grounds, he had promised them lasting rights to Snow Creek's water. The documents bore the signatures of tribal leaders and federal Indian agents alike. "Oh, Lord," Sage whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. These weren't just letters. They were legally binding treaties. Treaties that would supersede any railroad claims to the water rights. She sank onto the bed, papers clutched to her chest. The baby kicked, as if sensing her excitement. Here was the answer they'd been seeking, hidden away in this old trunk all along. God's providence, working through forgotten truth. But using these documents meant facing Vickers and his men again. The thought made her stomach clench with fear. She couldn't do it alone. She'd need Calvin's strength beside her. Sage bowed her head, the precious papers still held close. "Lord, grant me courage," she prayed softly, "and help me find the words to show Calvin this path to justice." Dawn painted the mountains in soft rose when Sage stepped out of the cabin. Her back ached as she lifted the heavy saddle onto Calvin's mule. The leather creaked beneath her hands, familiar from her farm girl days. Calvin emerged from the cabin, his limp more pronounced in the morning chill. His eyes widened when he saw her by the saddled mule. "You ain't riding in your condition," he protested, reaching for the reins. Sage straightened her spine, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "The Lord didn't spare me just to run," she said firmly. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "These letters need to be shown. Truth needs witnesses." Calvin studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He helped her mount, his strong hands gentle at her waist. They rode west toward Pine Crossing, the mule picking its way carefully along the muddy trail. Spring birds called from budding branches overhead. By mid-morning, smoke from the Ute camp rose through the trees ahead. Elder Noka received them outside his lodge, his weathered face grave as he examined the letters. His fingers traced the federal seals, the signatures of his people's leaders. "These speak truth," he said finally, looking up at them. "Our elders remember this promise. The creek waters were to flow free for all." He folded the papers carefully. "I will stand witness to these words, if needed." Sage's heart lifted at his solemn pledge. They rode on as afternoon shadows lengthened across the trail. By nightfall, Pine Crossing's lights glimmered ahead. Sage's muscles ached from the long ride, but her spirit felt stronger than ever. The shame that had haunted her for so long was being replaced by something new, the courage to stand for what was right. Calvin helped her down from the mule, his touch steadying her tired body. They had arrived exhausted but resolute in their purpose. Sheriff Brand's office smelled of coffee and wood smoke as Sage spread the letters across his desk. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, catching the official seals on the yellowed papers. Vickers lounged against the wall, arms crossed. "More frontier fairy tales," he sneered. "These mountain folk will forge anything to keep their squatters' rights." Elder Noka stepped forward, his presence commanding respect, despite Vickers' disdain. "These marks," he said, pointing to the signatures, "were made by my father's generation. I witnessed many such agreements in my youth." Sheriff Brand adjusted his spectacles, examining each document carefully. His weathered fingers traced the federal letterhead, the dates, the carefully penned promises about Snow Creek's waters. "These are genuine Treasury Department seals," he declared, "and these signatures match our territorial records." The smirk slid from Vickers' face like spring snow melting. His confident posture crumbled as Sheriff Brand rose from his desk. Mr. Vickers, Brand's voice rang with authority. You're under arrest for attempted land fraud and destruction of legal documents. He turned to his deputy. Fetch the irons. Sage's knees buckled with relief. Calvin caught her elbow, supporting her weight as she steadied herself against his solid frame. Through the window, she could see townsfolk gathering, drawn by the commotion. The same faces that had whispered cruel jokes at her wedding now turned away in shame. The railroad's claim is void, Sheriff Brand announced, loud enough for those outside to hear. Snow Creek lands stay with their rightful owners. Vickers' protests died in his throat as the deputy approached with handcuffs. Justice had come to Pine Crossing, carried on the strength of old promises and newfound courage. April brought warm winds to Snow Creek Pass. The mountain air softened, carrying the scent of thawing earth and pine sap. Calvin and Sage worked side by side, rebuilding their cabin's weather-worn porch. Each plank they laid felt like a fresh start. Where Vickers had burned their marriage license in the snow, purple wildflowers now pushed through the soil. Look there, Sage said, resting her hand on her full belly. The Lord makes beauty from ashes. The change in their neighbors came as gradual as spring itself. Mrs. Abernathy arrived first, a patchwork quilt bundled in her arms. For the little one, she said, eyes downcast with remembered shame. Others followed, the cooper's wife with a carved cradle, the miller's daughter with soft flannel squares. Each visit mended another tear in the fabric of their community. That evening, thunder rolled across the peaks. Sage was kneading bread when the first pain seized her. Calvin steadied her as she gripped the table edge, Hez, heart pounding harder than hers. It's time, she whispered. Through the night, Calvin never left her side. He wiped her brow with cool cloths and held her hand through each wave of pain. When fear crept into her eyes, he found words he thought he'd forgotten. The Lord is my shepherd. Sage's voice, though strained, joined his. I shall not want. They prayed together as thunder faded and stars wheeled overhead. Just as dawn's first light touched the cabin windows, a new cry split the air, strong and clear as morning. A daughter, Calvin breathed, watching in wonder as the tiny girl was placed in Sage's arms. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks as he saw all of heaven's mercy wrapped in that small bundle. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting golden rays across the rough-hewn floorboards. Sage dozed in the rocker, her newborn nestled against her chest, while Calvin swept the hearth clean of last night's ashes. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention, and through the window he spotted two familiar figures approaching on horseback. Sheriff Brand dismounted first, helping Reverend Thomas down from his dappled mare. The preacher clutched his leather registry book close, protecting it from the morning dew. Calvin met them at the door, pressing a finger to his lips before welcoming them inside. Heard tell there was cause for celebration up here, Sheriff Brand whispered, removing his hat. His eyes softened at the sight of Sage and the baby. The lawman who'd stood witness to their wedding now smiled like a proud uncle. Sage stirred, blinking awake. Sheriff Brand, Reverend Thomas, you're kind to make the journey. Her voice was tired but warm, like honey in summer tea. The preacher opened his registry, smoothing the pages with careful hands. Every child born in Pine Crossing gets recorded proper, he said. It's God's own bookkeeping, you might say. Calvin moved to Sage's side, his limp barely noticeable in his eagerness. With gentle hands that had once tracked elk and built cabins, he lifted his son. The baby's eyes opened, blue as mountain bluebells, and fixed on his father's face. A strong boy, Sheriff Brand observed, peering at the tiny features. Needs a strong name to match. Calvin stood straighter, cradling the child with sure hands. His voice carried the weight of revelation as he declared, "We'll call him Chance." He looked down at Sage, who nodded her agreement. "Because that's what the Lord gives, even to those who thought they were done for." Reverend Thomas dipped his pen in ink. "Chance Keel," he wrote in careful letters. "Born to Calvin and Sage Keel, this 15th day of April, 1869. "A good name," Sheriff Brand said. "Reminds folks that the good Lord ain't finished with any of us yet." After recording the birth, the men didn't linger. They understood the new family needed rest. Sheriff Brand pressed Calvin's hand firmly. "You done right by her, Keel. By both of them." As afternoon mellowed into evening, peace settled over Snow Creek like a warm blanket. Calvin worked by the window, his knife steady as he whittled at a piece of pine. Curls of wood fell at his feet, while a cradle took shape beneath his careful hands. The same hands that had once carried Sage through winter storms now carved gentle curves to rock their son to sleep. Sage sat nearby, humming Amazing Grace while she nursed the baby. Lamplight caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shine like morning frost. The tune filled their home with something more than music. It was the sound of mercy made whole. Through the open window came the evening sounds of Snow Creek. Wind in the pines, the distant call of a whip-poor-will, the gentle splash of the creek itself. These were no longer sounds of loneliness, but the harmony of home. Calvin paused in his work, watching his wife and son in the growing twilight. The cabin that had once sheltered his shame now glowed with lamplight and love. Snow Creek, which had witnessed their struggles and sorrows, now sang with the joy of promises kept and hope restored. In the peaceful twilight, as Sage's hymn filled the warm air, Calvin's heart echoed with gratitude. Here was his reward for choosing mercy over vengeance, not just survival, but revival. In the faces of his wife and son, he saw the truth written plain as scripture. Grace could make a family from fragments, and love could turn a mountain hermit's cabin into holy ground. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.